Lightning Ridge, Angledool and Walgett back in the day were the Wild West of New South Wales, and a person with medical skills was a very valuable person indeed. In this video we're going to take a look at 3 doctors from Lightning Ridge around the year 1900-ish with some pretty incredible stories. Henry George Kenrick, known as Jock or Doc, was a medical man at Angledool in the 1800s. You'll notice I said medical man and not doctor because he may not have actually been a doctor, but he certainly had the skills of one. His father was a surgeon back in England and apparently taught quite a few of his talents to his son, which proved very useful when he found himself at Angledool. Doc Kenrick was born in 1844 in Melksham, Wiltshire, England. He found himself in Australia sometime prior to 1877. Kenrick was a big man. He was tall, he was wide, and he was imposing. This photograph of him, the only photograph of him, comes with a comment that he was never one to wear a hat or coat. So this is not a typical representation of him. Kenrick was practicing, treating people, pretending to be a doctor. He was doing what he did best anyway at Angledool in the 1880s. A newspaper article from 1929 reminiscing about Doc Kenrick says that he was important to the area for 3 reasons. He was a doctor, he was a clever doctor, and he was the only doctor within 70 miles. I'm still not convinced he actually was a doctor. I can find evidence that he was a pharmacist or a chemist, and he was also the pound keeper, or the keeper of the impound lot at Angledool, where stray horses and dogs and belongings and whatever would be rounded up. He was also the local coroner, where at least an unregistered doctor can't make the patient any deader. But regardless of whether he was registered as a doctor, all of the stories about his work are very positive. One story tells of a young mother frantic about her 2-year-old son who was listless and unmotivated, which Kenrick diagnosed as nothing to be concerned about, but the mother insisted on a prescription anyway. Kenrick recommended castor oil, a common remedy for a ton of common ailments, but the mother was deeply unsatisfied and demanded that he do better and prescribe some real medicine. So Doc Kenrick went to his little back room in the pharmacy dispensary, and after a duration of clanging and banging and clinking of glass bottles, he emerged with a small paper satchel of powder tied up with string, which he handed to the mother, advising her to give a dose of the powder following the castor oil. Charging her a guinea, he sent her on her way. After her son recovered from his ennui, she returned to thank Doc Kenrick, who said, yeah, you can't beat icing sugar to pacify a kid after a dose of castor oil. I'm sure that story is as old as the hills, but it's still a lot of fun. In 1884, Doc Kenrick achieved something much more significant though. Angledool Station, from around 1873 onward, was managed by Robert Lismore Moore, who, among other things, can be credited with being the first person to find opal on the Lightning Ridge opal fields. Sometime around 1873, he found pieces of opal on the surface, collected them up and sent them to Sydney for valuation, but they were returned as worthless. In 1884, Bob Moore had a bit of an accident when he was cutting timber with a circular saw. A circular saw in 1884 was a machine as big as a house that was harnessed with a huge leather strap to the spindle of a steam tractor, so it was a pretty terrifying piece of equipment at the best of times. But while using one, Bob Moore had his hand dragged into the saw, slicing through his wrist. According to at least 2 newspaper reports from the time, his hand was pretty much severed and hanging by a thread of skin. Doc Kenrick treated Bob, reattached his hand, stopped the bleeding, and had Bob Moore transported to Walgett for additional medical treatment. So in 1884, Doc Kenrick, not a doctor, surgically reattached a severed hand, and Bob Moore, after months of convalescence, recovered from the accident. In 1885, Doc Kenrick was riding his horse to Walgett when he was thrown from the horse and fractured his leg in the fall. So he whipped out his medical bag, applied splints and bandages to himself, realigned the fracture, and set his own broken leg. Of course, he recovered. In 1886, he saved the life of an 18-month-old child who swallowed some vermin-destroying mixture, which I presume is rat poison. Kenrick treated the child in a marvellous and highly creditable way, which I again assume means that the kid survived just fine. In the same year, Kenrick was called to a case of sunstroke at Euroka Station, which he treated successfully. And just when you think he couldn't possibly outdo himself, at one point he was called to Gaduga to attend a man who had his skull smashed in, probably in a bar fight. The man's skull was completely cracked and his brain was apparently exposed. He wasn't expected to live. Kenrick went to the local blacksmith and paid him to forge up a steel plate of the appropriate curvature. Kenrick then installed it in the man's head, stitched him up, and he survived for at least another 30 years. In 1909, Kenrick had established himself in a small shop at the Nettleton settlement on the 3 Mile Flat, which is where I am now. It was apparently quite well appointed, with plenty of medicines. Doc Kenrick attended a victim of a mine collapse in 1910. In the same year, he also attended 3 miners who were incapacitated by stale air at the bottom of a mine shaft. The second and third men were trapped after they tried to rescue the first man, and all of them were caught without oxygen at the bottom of the shaft. So, for a man who wasn't a doctor, it seems he was a heck of a doctor. Unfortunately, the good news stories about Doc Kenrick stop in about 1887, when he unfortunately declared bankruptcy. A few years after that, here's where that content warning comes in. A few years after 1900, Doc Kenrick attempted to take his own life, but he survived. He was sentenced to 3 months in Walgett jail for that, because jail time is clearly the best possible way to recuperate someone who's having such thoughts. But anyway, that was sarcasm, just to be clear. There's not much reported after 1900 for Doc Kenrick. In 1911, he was taken ill and hospitalised with cancer. He passed away in the same year at the age of 67 years. His obituary in the Walgett Spectator that year makes it clear once again that Kenrick was not in fact a doctor, and he was given that title by the community because he did the things that a doctor does, and apparently he did them exceptionally well. So Doc Kenrick, by all accounts, seems to have been a pretty amazing person, although he had a bit of a rocky road later on in life. But it's worth remembering that Angledool, Walgett, Lightning Ridge around the turn of the century were rough places to be, and I can only imagine the responsibilities that were forced on someone with medical skills in that kind of environment, even someone who may not have been registered as a medical practitioner. The Lightning Ridge book by Stuart Lloyd mentions a Dr. Murray-Gibbes from Angledool, but it doesn't provide a great deal of information, so we've done some digging to see what we can uncover about this character. Lloyd says, Gibbes, Dr. Murray, of Angledool, went out looking for topaz, got lost, was in his slippers. He turned up near Gaduga 2 days later with bare, blistered feet. Lloyd's description kind of paints Dr. Murray-Gibbes as a bit of a space cadet, but I can assure you that that is far from the truth. As it turns out, the doctor's first name is John, and his surname was Murray-Gibbes, hyphenated. He was an Englishman born in 1843 in Hutton, Somerset. We have a photograph of Dr. John Murray-Gibbes, but it's not great, to say the least. Somewhere in amongst those 7 or 8 grey pixels is the face of a doctor. I know I'm going to cop a little bit of flack for this, but I'm going to show you a version of that photograph that's been enhanced by modern day magic. I'll just quickly address the AI situation. Yes, it's bad. Yes, it takes jobs. Yes, it's environmentally irresponsible. Yes, it creates soulless art. Yes, it pollutes social media with meaningless drivel as if social media didn't have enough of that already. But it also allows us to see surprisingly accurate recreations of faces from small and blurry photographs, which is exactly what we need right now. So, seeing as I've already expended the environmental resources it took to create this image simply for my own curiosity, it would be wasteful for me not to show you. So that is probably the face of Dr. Murray-Gibbes, at least it's a reasonable approximation of it. In around 1868, John Murray-Gibbes moved from the UK to New Zealand, where he lived for many years. He served in the New Zealand Territorial Forces while he was there, and also achieved a Master of Surgery and became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. Unlike Dr. Kenrick, Dr. Murray-Gibbes was a legitimate doctor with credentials. While in New Zealand, Murray-Gibbes developed a successful treatment for diphtheria by encouraging the patient to breathe the vapours of blue gum leaves. Eucalyptus has antimicrobial properties, and apparently it was quite successful in treating diphtheria. Given how prolific diphtheria was back in those days, I don't doubt for a second that this treatment would have saved countless lives and improved the quality of life for many others. Dr. Murray-Gibbes had some, shall we say, strong opinions on food and drink. He himself was a teetotaler, abstaining from alcohol entirely, in stark contrast to the other 2 doctors in this video, but he was passionately averse to stimulants, tea in particular. He felt that the Australian obsession with tea would be their undoing. Quoting from a New Zealand newspaper article from 1892, "Caffeine is a pure stimulant to the nervous system. It only acts in a more subtle way. With alcohol, you see most of the effects at once, but with caffeine, it's different, for it acts like a most insidious poison. There is a certain balance in the power of the nervous system, for if it is overstimulated, it afterwards suffers from a subsequent exhaustion, in which we see nervous irritability, atonic dyspepsia, neuralgia, decayed teeth, constipation, nervous headaches, inability to suckle children, increase of lunacy and frightful crimes, from want of control over the nervous system. These are the effects of tea drinking." I mean, yes, those are the extreme symptoms of overconsumption of caffeine, increase of lunacy and frightful crimes notwithstanding, but yeah, Dr. Murray-Gibbes overreacts just a little. Dr. John Murray-Gibbes came to Australia sometime prior to 1894. He was granted a medical practitioner's licence in 1899, and sometime prior to 1903, he found himself in Angledool. In 1903, he wrote a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald in favour of the extension of a railway line to Angledool and the positive benefits that bringing rail to the area would have on the community. And he's right. Check out this video from a very long time ago for more thoughts on the benefit of extending railway lines to where the people are. In 1904, while practicing medicine at Angledool, he sadly lost a 7-month-old baby who was under his care. This was documented in a newspaper report. After his time at Angledool, Dr. Murray-Gibbes found his way to Nowra on the New South Wales south coast, where he gave lectures on broad topics ranging from evolution by natural selection to the role of humanity in the universe to life on other planets, Mars in particular. He was really fascinated by Mars. As it turns out, Dr. Murray-Gibbes was actually quite advanced in his cosmological understanding. He quotes from Professor Percival Lowell of Flagstaff, Arizona, who describes Mars as a beautiful colour map where blue-green patches diversify an ochreish red ground crowned with brilliant white. There are no signs of mountains on the smooth expansion. Instead, an amazing system of reticulated lines is traceable over the whole surface, very like a spider's web. This mesh of linear markings takes on a more or less artificial look. All of these lines lead with absolute precision to definite centres. These lines are the much talked of canals of Mars. During the greater part of the year, about 99% of the Martian sky remains perfectly clear. Undoubtedly, vegetation exists, and therefore animal life. Murray-Gibbes then goes on to debunk this version of Mars, pointing out that Mars having no moon to create seismic events during its volcanic phase is why there are no mountains, explains the canals as being natural formations, and rules out the possibility of plant or animal life due to the absence of clouds in the sky. His reasoning is a bit wonky. We know now that Mars has 2 small moons and also the largest mountain in the solar system, but on a whole, Dr. Murray-Gibbes' deductions are mostly correct, or at least less wrong than Professor Lowell's. Dr. John Murray-Gibbes passed away in 1928 at Newport, New South Wales. I think it's worth acknowledging the achievements of Dr. Murray-Gibbes, particularly his innovations in diphtheria treatment, because his brief mention in Stuart Lloyd's book kind of paints him as a little bit of a loony, and it's worth remembering that Stuart Lloyd's book is a collection of information that he recorded from conversations with old opal miners and locals back in the late 50s and 60s, so it's likely that that anecdote was the only one that he was told about Dr. Murray-Gibbes, who had left Lightning Ridge decades before that book was written. Interestingly, Dr. Murray-Gibbes had a son who was a baritone opera singer and songwriter. You're actually listening to the piano part of one of his songs, Red Rosebud, in the background right now. It's a really depressing song. He wrote a few songs and performed a number of concerts, which is pretty amazing. Curiosity Mine is now on Patreon. Patreon is a service that allows you to directly support your favourite creators to allow them to continue making the content that you enjoy. If you enjoy these videos and you think the Curiosity Mine deserves your support, head on over to patreon.com/curiositymine or curiositymine.com/Patreon for more information on how you can support the channel directly. If you do, you'll get your name on this list of amazing people who are supporting the channel already. So head to patreon.com/curiositymine or curiositymine.com/Patreon. Choose your own adventure. But for now, let's get back to the Angledool doctors. And our third and final doctor is another doctor from Angledool around the same time as Doc Kenrick and Dr. Murray-Gibbes. And this one is even more strange and mysterious. Dr. Silverwood, for the longest time, has only been known from a bizarre throwaway paragraph in Stuart Lloyd's Lightning Ridge book, where he's painted as a little bit of a weirdo. Actually, he's painted as a lot of a weirdo. But in researching this video, we've managed to connect a few dots together and find out a little bit more about Dr. Silverwood's story. So let's start with what Stuart Lloyd has to say. Silverwood, doctor, at Angledool, would look at the sun for an instant and close his eyes, then made drawings of what he saw. He called the objects so discerned brain cells. He wrote a scientific article on this. A terrible man to drink whiskey. He also dipped arrowroot biscuits in whiskey at morning and afternoon tea. Nevertheless, a clever doctor. Let's break that down, starting with some background on Silverwood himself. His full name was Dr. William Bedford Silverwood. He was born in Shelley, Yorkshire, England. In 1862, he came to Australia in 1906 on a ship called the Ayrshire. He was a registered doctor in the UK, and he was certified in Manchester. Unlike the other two doctors, Dr. Silverwood found his way to Lightning Ridge via the opal fields at Whitecliffs. Dr. Silverwood was undoubtedly alcoholic, if not worse, as indicated in Stuart Lloyd's anecdotes about him dipping biscuits in his whiskey and being a terrible man for drinking the stuff. He was actually dismissed from medical service at Whitecliffs for drinking on the job, as well as using drugs and administering questionable medication choices to his patients. What got him fired was, while drinking on the job, he provided a poisonous concoction to a patient who wanted to end his own life, so that he would have the means to do so at his own discretion. That's kind of progressive when you consider the modern stance on assisted end-of-life options for terminal patients, but we don't know the full story of this particular patient. And also, Dr. Silverwood was drinking and taking drugs himself when he provided the medication. Anyway, complicated and not what you want your doctor to be doing. But it's also consistent with Stuart Lloyd's depiction of Dr. Silverwood as a bad drinker. After that, Silverwood found his way to Angledool. There were a lot of people making the move from Whitecliffs to Lightning Ridge in the early 1900s. Dr. Silverwood was in residence at Angledool in 1911. And then there's his habit of staring at the sun. So first, don't do that. It's really not good for your eyes. Without knowing exactly what Dr. Silverwood is looking at, it seems likely that he was either experimenting with an after image, the temporary burn-in that you get when you've looked at something very bright for a few seconds, or he might have been seeing eye floaters, which are the blurry little dark strands that drift across your field of vision that are especially visible when you stare at a clear blue sky, which makes me think that Dr. Silverwood was paying attention to those. While eye floaters are certainly not brain cells, they're generally made up of deteriorated or slightly damaged tiny bits of the inside of your eye. The eye is about as closely connected to the brain as you can get without being part of the brain itself, so maybe he was onto something. He was also taking one for the team by, risking permanent eye damage in the name of research, or maybe he was just a weirdo who likes staring at the sun. I don't know. I have searched for the scientific article that Dr. Silverwood allegedly wrote about his brain cell research, but unfortunately I've turned up nothing. Peer-reviewed papers in the early 1900s are pretty tricky to come by, and there's a distinct possibility that Stuart Lloyd is referring to an article that was not published in a scientific journal and was just an article that was scientific in nature. Or perhaps it was actually something that was more akin to the ravings of a madman. I don't know, but I'm not going to give up trying to find it. Watch this space. In 2019, Dr. Elizabeth Smith from the Australian Opal Centre, you may remember Dr. Smith from these videos. Dr. Smith is an accomplished artist and held an exhibition of works at the AOC's Black Opal Heritage Shed. The exhibition was called The Old Fields, and it included a number of artworks inspired by passages from Stuart Lloyd's Lightning Ridge book, one of which was an interpretation of Dr. Silverwood, represented by an upside-down man chasing a stream of brain cells into a vein of opal. It's marvellous, and ever since I saw this picture I've been fascinated by Dr. Silverwood and his little mention in Stuart Lloyd's book. The downside to stories about people from over a century ago is that they inevitably end on a sad note, and Dr. Silverwood's story is of course no different. William Bedford Silverwood passed away on the 28th of February 1912, drowning on a Manly beach in Sydney. He was visiting the beach with a mate who tried desperately to swim out and save him, but he didn't make it in time, and unfortunately Dr. Silverwood didn't make it back to the shore. Dr. Silverwood is buried at Rookwood Necropolis. Forgive the shameless plug, but do go watch that video about Rookwoods. It's such an incredible place, so much history, fun video to make. Do visit Rookwood if you get the chance, you won't regret it. So those are three doctors who were at Lightning Ridge, or Angledool, around the turn of the 20th century, all with pretty remarkable stories. If you're interested in medicine and medical facilities at Lightning Ridge in the early days, be sure to check out this video about the Bush Nurse Association cottage, which now forms part of the Lightning Ridge Historical Society's museum in Marilla Street, Lightning Ridge. Research for this video has been a collaborative effort by myself and Lisa Carney, and sources include information from the Lightning Ridge Historical Society, the Lightning Ridge book by Stuart Lloyd, documents from the National Library of Australia, the Walgett Spectator, government records from Australia and the United Kingdom, and documents from private collections. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Curiosity Mine on YouTube and maybe even supporting the channel directly via Patreon. There's a link in the description. My God, I feel like Dr. Silverwood right now because that sun is really bright. I don't see brain cells though. So yeah, Patreon if you want to. You don't have to, no pressure. But thanks for watching.